Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the return of Irish Rural Links webinars, which have been so successful throughout the summer. We've looked at various discussions regarding rural welfare and the rural experience, particularly in these difficult times of the pandemic. I think when we started these webinars some months ago, we thought this would be a short-term plan. Pandemic would be over, the masks would be no longer there, and we'd be back to normal. And as you can see, we're not back to normal. We're still having the webinars, which, thanks to you for joining in this morning, have been a huge success. This morning, we're starting off with a little bit of a bang. We're talking about the budget. I know everybody is not exactly a massive fan and would love to talk about better things and more entertaining things. But whether we like it or not, the budget of this year is going to be one of the most significant events and will affect our lives in a way we hope will be for the better. But certainly they will affect our lives. We know, according to The Economist, the country is falling down. We know we have a massive deficit building up. We know the cost of this pandemic is outstretching all possible estimates. But we also know, having been through the last recession, do we want to make the same mistakes again? I have this morning with me really three brilliant guests who know about this in a way better than I do and better than many other people. I'll start with welcoming Dr. Sean Healy, the CEO of Social Justice. They are an independent social justice think tank. You'll get them on www.socialjustice.ireland. And Sean has experience across the world. He's worked in Africa, he's worked in America. He's very much involved with the work of the European Commission, Council of Europe. And he has and the organization he works for, they've done huge work in developing and helping the public participation networks, which are part of the local authority. I know he wants me to credit Sister Bridget Reynolds, who also has done many of this work, and she has assisted him in publishing over 40 books over the years. And as I said, they're there on the website, and so welcome, Sean. Dr. Catherine Farrell is a research fellow with the School of Natural Sciences, Trinity College, Dublin. She is working as a lead ecologist on INCASE. Now that means Irish Natural Capital Accounting for Sustainable Environments. And a very interesting concept in terms of informing us on what a budget should look like. And of course, Catherine will cover the realities, which would probably be the main subject if we hadn't the pandemic. She will be covering really what the budget will mean for those of us worried about climate change, worried about the environment and other matters connected with that. Our third guest, so welcome very much to Catherine. Our third guest, John Bryan. John is he's a farmer, of course, but he's a former president of the IFA. He was the 13th president, in fact. He's also a member of the European Economic Social Council. John has really become an expert on the Common Agricultural Policy, or maybe some people call it the Rural Development Programme, whichever you like to call it. He has done some major reports in Europe, which have certainly influenced what we think will be the next Common Agricultural Policy document. So John, you're very welcome as well. Sean, I'm going to start with you because everybody who knows Social Justice Ireland will know you do a great summary of what the budget is looking like, or should be looking like, or even the problems facing our esteemed friends Pascal and Michael. So maybe I give you a chance to see. And by the way, before I do, those of you who are zoomed into us or connected this morning, there's a chat button in the bottom of your screen. We really want you to ask questions, as many as you like, and be as contrary as you like. We'd be quite happy to see them all. So Sean, giving you that sort of start is enough. What's facing the two ministers at the moment?
Well, thanks, Seamus. And I think an unusual comment maybe for an opening discussion on the budget. All budgets are moral documents. They represent what a government values and how they intend to meet their objectives. So I think that's important to bear in mind, because it's not just about money, and it's not just about the economy. And we would say that the key value that should guide budget 2021 should be the principle that no one is left behind. there's a huge amount of stuff going on that's going to impact on the budget. People are very aware of it. COVID is there and its consequences. The Brexit is there and its consequences. The other things that are part of the context as well that maybe mightn't be as much part of the discussion, but should be, the fact that we have growing inequality over the last 10 years in Ireland and that this is getting worse and we're not really dealing with it. The fact that we have failed to get to grips with poverty generally, like we still have huge 680,000 people in poverty, 200,000 kids in poverty. And not alone that, but that rural poverty is higher than urban poverty. And we have just developing that more. There's an urban-rural divide that we have failed to deal with a whole lot of different things that people who are listening to us this morning are well aware of. Now, I think that as the government prepares the budget, it needs to have a different focus to the usual. The usual focus they have is to sort of see how they can reduce their borrowing or balance the budget or put some money away, whatever it is. I think this time the government should basically have three imperatives. One, that the primary focus should be on increasing employment and delivering both infrastructure and services. Infrastructure in terms of issues like social housing, public transport, rural broadband, and then services in health, education, childcare, elder care, and things of that nature. Secondly, that a huge amount, the second thing they should focus on, that a huge amount of borrowing will be needed, maybe 30 billion this year and maybe 20 billion next year, and that this borrowing is affordable, and that basically what they should do is borrow that money and put it together with the borrowing of a similar kind that has to go with from every country in Europe, warehouse it in Brussels, borrow the money from the European Central Bank and other areas and other banks, and then basically put it and deal with the huge borrowing that's there, deal with that over a 40 or 50 year period, paying back the low interest and so on, slowly doing it in the same way that we dealt with the bills of the First World War, the Second World War, and so on, because otherwise we will have a huge problem in which all the governments of Europe will have very serious issues in terms of trying to deal with the challenges being faced. Now, I think that with the opportunity that we have, like with the terrible things that have happened with COVID and so on, and we have an opportunity over the next 2 or 3 years to not only restore the demand for labour, but to address social and infrastructure deficits, to strengthen the economy, to protect the environment. I think it's very important to face up to a major mistake that Irish governments have made in recent years, in which they have given priority to the economy, and they have basically said, get the economy right and everything else will follow. We did that and we got the Celtic Tiger and we had an explosion. We did that after the bank crash 10 years or 11 years ago, and we put the banks back together and we put the same focus on the economy. And again, we built one of the biggest, the richest economies in the world, but like we didn't deal with all the other stuff. So what we're saying is the failure of the mistake they're making is they're focusing only on the economy first. We're saying there are 5 things that need to be looked at simultaneously, not in sequence. First of all, you need a vibrant economy. That's actually taken as given. But you also need decent services and infrastructure. And we need to and you need to do those at the same time, because without those decent services and infrastructure, you won't have a vibrant economy. You also need to develop just taxation. Now, that's not a recipe for raising income tax. It's about broadening the tax base, making sure the corporate sector pays a fair share, particularly the large transnationals, and so on. The 4th area is good governance. We need good governance because and good governance involves engagement by the various sectors, the various pillars in Irish society, so that they are actually part of the framing of budgets and other decisions. And finally, and critically important, is the issue of sustainability. We need to be environmentally sustainable. We need to deal with climate issues, which are hugely problematic, and all the various things associated there. We also need to deal with the sort of making choices that are economically sustainable, because there's no point in going from boom to bust to boom to bust that we've been going to for the last number of decades. So we have to stop that. And the third thing is it needs to be socially sustainable, because if it isn't socially sustainable, we're in serious trouble, because people obviously won't want to live in that kind of society. Now, in all of that, finally, because I know I don't want to talk too long, but just to say that the challenges that faced rural Ireland prior to the current pandemic remain. including an older population. There's higher rates of part-time employment. There's lower median incomes. There's distance from everyday services. There's higher poverty rates than the national average. And in addition, there's new challenges have emerged, not least the impact of the potentially prolonged period of unemployment on areas that are already struggling. Now, later on in our conversation, I'll come back to some concrete proposals about dealing with that, but they're the kinds of things I think that should form the center focus of the budget. We have an opportunity because of COVID to try and build a different future and a different approach. It has to be more integrated. It has to see the development simultaneously of a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance and sustainability. And when we put that in place, I think, and work simultaneously to that, we're much more likely to develop a fairer future in which nobody is left behind.
Thanks very much, Sean. And I'm still welcoming. I'm seeing people joining. Please ask questions, of course. Catherine, I suppose if we didn't have the pandemic, we would now be talking full head on and in some sort of an environmental related budget, and Irish Rural Link would be giving out about carbon tax, which we still do, might as well tell you. So where do you feel, what do you feel in terms of this budget and what's the priorities?
Well, I think everything that Sean said is equally matched for the environment. So I suppose progressive and successive budgets have really focused on how do we drive the economy, how do we get more money in the system, how do we, how do we focus only on the economy, and that to the detriment of social aspects and nature. And you're right, if the pandemic hadn't happened and we didn't have, all of these issues that face us now, we would be focused on nature solely. But we can't ignore it, because we still have a biodiversity crisis, we still have a climate crisis, and those things haven't gone away. And in fact, I suppose the pandemic has shown us that nature underpins everything that we do. And there have been links with the pandemic and the destruction of nature, and that's one of the root causes of the spread of this virus. So we can't ignore these things. And to Sean's point, I think to have a more balanced view on life, that we have economy is important. You need finance to do all these wonderful things that we want to do for people, but we need to have that balance with society and with nature. So to have a healthy natural world and a healthy environment, it's not a nice to have anymore. So that's one of the key messages that I would be conveying to the ministers when they're writing their budget. It's not just something to stick on at the end. It has to underpin everything, because nature underpins everything that we do. So back to Sean's point again, you can't just focus on one thing and say, now we've ticked the box on the nature side. You have to go and work and enable change across all sectors, because we're all responsible. So it's not just the farming, it's the infrastructure, it's the energy. So to decarbonize and to work towards a more sustainable environment. So change across all sectors. And I suppose to focus in, if you wanted to focus in on biodiversity, it's to invest in structures like the National Parks and Wildlife Service, to invest in structures like LawPro, where you have community liaison people working on the ground, enabling communities to work and improve their environment. Because that's how we have to have top-down and bottom-up approaches, because it just doesn't work without community buy-in. And you know that, Seamus, from all of the work that you've done in the environment, and that's the only way towards sustainable environment. From the perspective, I think, it's to facilitate the change within farming. And, nature and farming go hand in hand. Farmers are, they are the custodians of most of the natural world that we have in Ireland. And there have been absolutely brilliant projects established through the European Innovation Programme that are facilitating change and showing that it doesn't cost the earth It doesn't cost a load of money. It's small changes within the farming system, but farmers to be compensated and recompensated for the work that they're doing, because all the services provided in rural Ireland are for everyone across the world. So the rural communities are the ones that are going to enable this sustainable nature for us. So communities, farming, all of the sectors within, cross-sectoral change. So I can't emphasize it enough. It's not a nice to have.
Thank you. Certainly, absolutely. I completely go along with that, because I'm going to mention, if you don't mind, the Wetlands Forum, which work with Irish Rural Link, and the work Chris Hughes has done as the officer there working with communities. I think you're absolutely right. And I would hope that those listening would remember that you can only bring change about by working with the communities. John, you know, from a farming perspective, I know IFA have their budget submission done, and I know other organisations. What are farmers worried about in terms of this budget, and what are they looking for?
Good morning, Seamus, and good morning to your listeners. Probably, Seamus, one of the things, and back with the two previous speakers, this has been a very strange year in rural Ireland. Lockdowns and lots of social interaction, closing of rural pubs, closing of a lot of small businesses. And whether some of those will ever open again is a question. And those provide huge necessary services. So I'm going to talk about three budgets, unfortunately. There's the domestic budget in Ireland, which is very important day to day. There's the CAP budget, which will be a transition year. And then there's what we here in Europe call the what did they call recovery fund, 750 billion to try and get. But I'm very annoyed that I'm totally supportive of the Green Deal, which is for what Catherine was on, protecting biodiversity, strategic plans. But at the same time, of that 750 billion, agriculture got 7.5 billion, 1%. They're being asked to take on a huge amount of the environmental work. And Father Sean Healy was there, Catherine was there. It costs money to protect the environment. And there's the whole competitiveness area. But on the domestic budget, Seamus, it's very important that the government rolls over existing rural development schemes. So what I'm talking about there are schemes like the GLOS that are quite important for the environment and also very important for small and medium-sized farmers to maintain their income. The government is speaking about a REP scheme, which I think is very important, and we would see over the years REPs led to huge improvement in farmer practices, things like spreading slurry earlier, so a lot less leaching, fencing off water courses, planting hedgerows. So a scheme like that is absolutely essential, and it has to be funded. But it also, the money, they can't just clean out the rural development fund, because schemes like the beef data genomics scheme, that's very important to continue to maintain the suckler herd in Ireland. The tax release for young farmers, to let young farmers come into, because certainly generational renewal is very important. And Seamus, you see it in Offaly, I see it in Kilkenny. We see it all over the country, farms that would be viable enterprise, and the next generation, they want a 9-to-5 job, they want the social inclusion. So this is where the points made by Father Sean Healy, if you haven't got rural services, broadband, but the ability to mix with your neighbours. Where I am from, and you were speaking about earlier, I wouldn't be the strongest man on GA. But GA is so important in rural Ireland. It gets people meeting that younger generation. That's what keeps them healthy, keeps them active, and takes mental strain off them. So I think getting that up and going, I think the government maybe kept the lockdown going a bit longer. We're all for protecting health and that, but we also have to think about people's mental health. So I think the government have to have proper funding of all the rural development schemes. And a huge threat facing all of Ireland and rural Ireland is Brexit. They're going to have to, and again, I totally agree with Father Sean Healy here, we borrow. They made huge mistakes in 2009, 10 and 11. We nearly closed the economy down. We closed down hospitals, we closed down services, and it took years to recover. Public service ran out of a lot of experienced staff and weren't recruiting, which would have cost them very little, because between the tax people pay and not paying them unemployment, there was an overreaction the last time. We cannot do that again. It's important that if we have, I absolutely agree, borrow for 2020, borrow for 21, and if we have to for 23 and 4, we were never able to borrow money cheaper. and to get the country going and maintain those jobs. And again, agriculture can play a huge part in that, keeping the local market going, keeping the co-ops open, keeping a bit of activity. And that leads to back to what Captain is. If the farmer is living on that, he'll protect the hedgerows, he'll protect the water courses. The worst thing could happen to us is a lot of small and medium farmers go out of business and that land gets abandoned. And I mentioned it earlier on, leads to forest fires and everything where the land is abandoned. So I think a proper plan, and there's a term Seamus uses often, and I totally agree with him, that there has to be a just transition, leave no one behind. But I do not believe that the Green Deal is properly funded. I believe it's an essential plan. It's Europe wanting to move forward to protect biodiversity, to reduce our climate emissions, to protect water, and to invest in the future generations. But they didn't put the funding into it. They've put far more funding into coal mines in Germany and Poland than they're willing to put in to protect biodiversity. So I think a social deal has to accompany a Green Deal. And President von der Leyen made her speech there 2 days ago. It was very lacking on funding and the social inclusion. There was much more. She was very strong on the Green Deal. She was very strong in Europe, a united Europe, which I believe in, but very weak on funding to deliver this social deal. And for 450 million people, Seamus, 750 billion was insignificant.
Right, John. Well, you are exciting some comment, one of which was, how did we let a non-GA Kilkenny man onto the panel? So you can deal with that in your own good time. And other questions are coming in. Sean, one of the questions I have here in text is, you know, let's just for a minute concentrate on poverty levels. Lots of people are saying, one comment here says, look, luckily our family, we haven't lost our jobs yet, but our jobs are subsidized by the COVID scheme, and that could go on into next year or whatever. Will we have those jobs afterwards? And we want a clear statement in the budget to sort of explain to us what's the direction we're going here. Sean, is it the case that if we're not careful, yes, we don't have people unemployed in the same numbers as we might have had, but we are subsidizing at a massive high level. Is this can this last, is the question?
I think that the reality as you outline it is exactly what the situation is. I think we have to first of all recognize that a post-COVID world is going to be fairly different to anything that we've got before. It's not a question of going back to where we were. Now, how many jobs will be kept? We have or will survive? I have no idea. But but I think a large proportion of the ones that are there will survive. But there will certainly be losses as well. Okay, and I think what we have to be able to do is to try and support as much as we can, and gradually identify the ones that are going to fly and make sure that they fly, because it's much cheaper, as John was pointing out, to subsidize a job than to pay to have that job collapse. They get no tax from it and then have to pay welfare as well. So in actual fact, it makes sense to subsidize quite a lot of stuff. Now, the reason that I think we're moving like that, we need to face up to the fact that things like the welfare system are not appropriate for the 21st century. And that's one of the arguments that we've been using for decades, arguing in favor of the introduction of a basic income system. And I must say, I look around the world today, and all over the place, people are talking about basic income in all sorts of different approaches and ways of doing it and so on, which is very good. But that's not going to come in this budget. But in reality, of course, the government is taking a look at it and thinking of piloting something in Ireland as part of the programme for government. Now, there's one other piece in there that's important to put in, and that is the just transition issue. Because there's no point in Ireland and the government or Irish people generally expecting that farmers can sort of give up a particular approach to farming that they've been doing for decades or centuries, and expecting that to be sort of that they can walk away from that unless there are alternatives, unless there's another pathway set out. So what I would be arguing is very strongly is that there should be serious money in the budget for regional development and for that transition. And the types of funding should be used to invest, for example, in smart villages to support remote working. Like, because if you can work in the village, from the village, then it makes a complete different impact on the economy, because people aren't just commuting into Dublin or into the nearest city or wherever it is every day. There's also a need for education for the current and future generation of farmers to move to more sustainable agricultural methods. But there's also on that side the working out of markets and developing farm to fork approaches that would actually be viable in a post-COVID world. There's also the need to develop, as pointed out already, local co-ops and various things of that nature, and improving and expanding public services. I would be also putting money into things like rural transport. I would, if I was running the budget in the morning, I'd put an additional 50 million into rural transport program immediately, and I'd put 10 million into our cycling and walking infrastructure. And another thing there as well is the whole broadband issue. If we just depend on the program rolling out that government signed last year, I think it's far too slow. And I think we would in Social Justice Ireland propose a 300 million additional investment to support red zones and to support LEOs to develop remote working hubs and smart villages and our digital agenda for Europe, the targets that we have there. So there's a variety of different things that are required. One final thing, which I know is close to your own heart, is the community and voluntary sector. It was decimated after the last crash 10, 11, 12 years ago with the banks going bad. And we lost over half our funding. Most of that has never been recovered. Now I'm talking about the community and voluntary sector, not Social Justice Ireland.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And like there needs to be a package of maybe something like 500 million to support the community and voluntary sector to address the current funding gap in the budget for 2021. And I think we need to take a serious look at the types of things that are required. Otherwise, like a huge amount of the services and so on are delivered by community voluntary organizations in rural areas, and they are the conduit for carrying it. And that's another thing that we found out. Of course, goes back to the issue of what jobs you maintain and so on. One of the things we discovered during the COVID time was a lot of the heroes of that time were people who had low-paid jobs, doing work that we didn't actually value at all before that. Now the problem is they're still getting paid little for those things. They're paid too little, and there's over 100,000 people in Ireland, many of them in rural Ireland, who actually have a job but are still living in poverty. That's not viable in the long run.
Absolutely, Sean, and I can tell you, in the program we had volunteers around the country. We had lots of people who were in those low-paid jobs that you were talking about, and absolutely doing enormous work. In fact, keeping people going and, in a sense, out of the hospitals. I think that's very important. Catherine, I see you're getting comments about the labour market, and you might like to deal with that. And Colin, I'll come back. I see Colin Flynn has a comment which we'll come to in a moment. But let me, Catherine, get this out of the way, because some of the members of Irish Rural Link have a rather dim view of the carbon tax. So we'll get that out of the way as quick as possible. I suppose the way they see it is it comes in, it's an environmental measure, but if you live down a boreen and the only way you can get up it is a diesel car or a petrol car, you're ending up paying the carbon tax no matter what. So it's an increase. And we felt and still feel that government haven't properly made available funds to counteract the cost of carbon tax, especially on lower income farmers and lower income families, in fact. And it's not probably just rural. So I'm just getting what's your take on that, or have you thought about that?
I haven't really thought about it, but I would agree with you that it seems to be an unjust way of doing things, in that, again, the person on the low income is suffering because they're living out in a rural community. And I think there are these injustices, and it's part of climate justice and social justice. So it's how we value all the different aspects. There's not one size solution for everyone across the board, and you have to take that into consideration. I think so. That's how I'd respond to that. I was just looking at question, and I was just, when Sean was talking about supporting remote working hubs, and I'm a researcher based in Dublin. I live in Tullamore, Okay, so before COVID, I was up and down to Dublin, and I was sitting on a Cairns bus for, 4 hours for a journey. And I wasn't the only one. And then suddenly COVID happens. And all of those people that I saw every morning who were racing out at 6:30 to sit on this public commute, this rush into Dublin, are now at home or they're working from home. So we need to embrace that as a positive change for people to be able to have more time at home, more time with their families, but to support them with remote working hubs in small villages and community towns, places like Kilbeggan that are close to me. And, we all know that. But the benefits for the environment are massive. So, automatically you're not putting as much diesel in your car. You're not putting the fumes into the atmosphere. There's so many benefits, and we saw that across the globe. That people in India could see the sky because, for the first time, emissions were reduced. So, I think we're all singing the song that small changes make big differences. And we've seen that in the pandemic. The world that we go into is not going to be the same. And what I would like to see us working together more for climate justice, for social justice, justice across farming network. But, what Colm says there is true. There's so many people in rural Ireland that aren't farming, or maybe they're part-time farming. And I know a lot of my family members are part-time farmers, but then they have to go out and drive to work as well. So it's about facilitating that and enabling that change for a better environment, better quality of life, and better produce. People were buying locally. They're spending their money in their hometown because they're not spending it when they go to buy a sandwich in Dublin instead. So there are some positives. So that's my tuppence there for Colm.
Thank you. And I see Senator Roisin Garvey goes along with some of the comments you've been making there. And I think she's sort of wondering if the main speakers have thought about how we even see this progressing. But John, Colm Flynn has a comment there as well, and it ties in a bit with what Roisin is saying. And this is a bit provocative, John, so he says, are we missing the opportunity by focusing too much on farming and agriculture in terms of the future of rural Ireland? And, we have to make the cities work as well. Yes, agriculture is a critical part, but we can't rely on it alone. That's, he kind of making the point that that farming is just one part of the economy. So what do you see in that? What's your response?
Well, I'd say no one would say we could rely on it alone, Seamus. Basically, agriculture is very important to the social fabric of rural Ireland. And as Father Sean Healy said, we're talking about generations, hundreds of years of agricultural activity in Ireland going back to the Celts. So the reality is it makes a huge contribution. And the farms that still retain all their hedgerows, protect their water courses, permanent pasture, they're making a huge contribution to protection of biodiversity, providing public service, ecosystem services, as my friend Tia Hennessy would call it. So agriculture has a huge, it's not going to be the only one. Anyone who thinks it is making a huge mistake. But in real terms, the Irish government puts in maybe 500 million a year into the agricultural rural schemes. It's very small compared to what's put in some other areas. So agriculture gets a certain amount from Europe through the single farm payment. The rural development funding is joint funded by Ireland. Ireland has now become a huge net contributor to Europe for 2020. And one of the few areas we get money back, because theoretically we're deemed to be a wealthier country, we're not getting very little under structural funds or other areas. So the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the areas, and it's very important that an Irish government fights to maintain that budget. But in the next budget period from 2020 or 21 to 27, the cap has gone from being 70% of the EU budget to 50%, 38% the last time, 28% this time. And that's excluding the fact that we're only getting 1% of the recovery fund. So I would be saying, unfortunately, agriculture is getting a much smaller share of the EU budget and a way smaller share of the national budget. So, but I also agree that funding into rural transport, funding into maintaining jobs, I'm very strong that we need services in rural Ireland. And I think sometimes people forget there is a two-speed Ireland. There's a rural Ireland and there's that 30, 40 kilometres or miles around Dublin that all the foreign direct investment goes into, all the big companies move into. There's a much higher wage level there. There's much more availability of services and that. But yet, when the further you go into rural Ireland, the distance you are from an A&E, the distance you are from a local Garda station, and in some places, not quite as bad as it used to be, the road infrastructure doesn't be great. Where I live, you always have to be watching for a car coming nearly a half mile out, because if the two you meet in a narrow spot, someone is going to have to back up a half a mile. You know, so there is totally different services. We pay for our own water. We're not on the streets giving out about the cost of water, but we pay for our own water. We pay for our own disposal of rubbish. We supply our own services, and we try as much as possible to have a strong community. And I things like I was, as you know, I was involved in the IFA, very strong club where I'm the GAA, different sports. There's areas that's essential to rural Ireland. As you say, up your country, you have a very strong network of rural link. We've just got to have those voluntary schemes. We've got to have, and unfortunately, and I think I said this to someone yesterday, 30 years ago, the church was very strong in rural Ireland. Its position has slipped down a bit now, and that's a loss too, because there's not the same level of support there that was there. And it affects, because one of my colleagues yesterday was talking about Belarus, James. I'm rambling along this now.
Yeah, I'll be stopping you in a second now. Go on.
Well, the church played a big part in helping Solidarity in Poland, but there's no one there now to help. So the people are on the streets and giving out that they're not getting as much support from Europe as they would like. So that's me rambling, Seamus.
That's grand, John. I'll stop you there. Sean, you're coming in next, and I'm going to link you with Anne Drury of the National Active Ireland. She's National Treasurer of Active Ireland, is worried about people and older people and that. But Sean, I think you wanted a comment there, but I'd like you to sort of link into the older people as well.
Okay. The comment I wanted to do was about the carbon tax, that there's a sleight of hand going on with the government on carbon tax. Carbon tax was never meant to be a means of increasing the tax take. It was meant to be something that would change people's behavior. The whole point about the carbon tax is that the money gained from it is, and like they're talking about putting it up €7.50 a tonne, that's 130 million in a full year that they would bring in. But the point was, that money should then be used not as revenue to say we have an additional 130 million, but rather it should be spent on targeted measures to protect those most affected by the carbon tax, in particular low-income households and rural dwellers. Because given the significant climate challenges we now face, a carbon tax is an important tool, but you have to use the money as was originally intended to deal with the hits that are being taken there. Now, for older people, to take that up, I think that one of the things that we discovered in COVID is that the treatment of older people and the care of older people was not maybe at the level that we thought it was, because an awful lot of nursing homes took ferocious hits in the early days of COVID, and a lot of the deaths that happened early on and the outbreaks and so on, and the sort of centers of problem were in nursing homes and various issues of that nature. Now, it seems to me that what we need is an approach, to change the approach so that we would be trying to develop the best sort of capacity for older people to age well at home. Most older people do not want to be going into an institution, into a nursing home, into a hospital, into anything of that nature. They want to basically age at home and age well at home. But that means that they have to have various things in place. They have to have the actual housing issue has to be dealt with. The health issue has to be dealt with. The supports for helping older people who aren't maybe that mobile to be able to do their shopping and do the various other things that are required, to put that in place. And I think the HSE is moving slowly in that direction. And basically we need a good linkage between the housing department and the health department, the HS and the HSE, to try to ensure that we are delivering a suite of services that support older people. And with new technology, this is actually being developed very sharply. And if I would give a shout out to an organization that I think most people know do a good job, and that's Alone. Alone are doing a fantastic job in trying to develop programs around the country where this is actually happening, where they work with a whole load of other organizations to try to develop these kinds of integrated services for older people. And they have the technological support to do it, that older people have an iPad or a tablet or whatever, and they can keep track of what they have to do, but they also keep track of, and the centre can keep track of how they're doing, and they can get very instant reactions, and they get very up-to-date information compared to the way things were. The potential is there to do a very good job, but it does mean that we have to put in the appropriate housing, we have to put in the appropriate healthcare stuff, and the other services. And I might mention one close to your own heart, Seamus, Meals on Wheels.
Yeah.
Like Meals on Wheels play a critical issue for older people in urban and rural Ireland, but especially in rural Ireland. But and they're not being supported. They're run almost completely by volunteers. Yeah. And there's a huge amount, and you know a lot more about it than I do, but the actual reality there is that they need the support for a very small, relatively small investment. Government gets a huge sort of bounce, if you like, for support for older people. And the fact that they can get healthy meals delivered and up halfways up mountains and all the rest of the way out where the public service isn't maybe too willing to go. In actual fact, it would be very good spending of money to support things like Meals on Wheels and that. But you might want to say something yourself on that.
Indeed, Sean, and we know that you could actually prolong people who wish to stay at home. Most older people wish to stay at home. They don't want to go into nursing homes unless it's inevitable. And you could prolong up to 30% or 40% of the time that they may end up there anyway by staying at home, by services to the door. We also know it's cost effective, and you know that's proven time and time again. And if we're into well-being, and Sean and you, Sean, and Catherine and John, you've talked about a more holistic budget that measures just more than, as you said, Catherine, the money flow. If you're really measuring a budget in a proper way, well then a lot of older people are having to go into nursing homes when in fact they could stay a lot longer in their homes, and these services shouldn't be left to the voluntary sector. They should be properly managed, professionalized, and give the service people required. And it's, Sean, you giving me a chance to ranting myself. Sorry, John, we're all good at the ranting. Catherine, I'm really interested in your and you're getting good comments here. In terms
well, I might pick up on the one about the peatland restoration.
Yes, take that one.
And I suppose just, you know, a last comment on, you know, the discussion there. I wrote a book about nursing homes, and
you're very modest. We'll have to publish that book. Or
we'll have to spread it out, but you know, it's how we treat the vulnerable in our communities, and we're all going to be there. And in a way, I see how we treat nature and biodiversity in the same category, that it's, you know, it's always there. It's something that you just neglect because, you know, we don't see the real value or the use in this. So that's my take on that. There's a question there around peatland restoration and communities. And I suppose, you know, I worked with Bord na Móna for 20 years on peatland restoration, and I worked across Ireland, and I was lucky enough to also extend the network across the Northern Hemisphere, and learning on how you do this and how you get the funding to the ground and make the most of the money and all that sort of thing. And I have to say, you know, the guys I worked with in Bord na Móna were fantastic, and I'm really talking about the machine operators, but if you want a company to lead on peatland restoration, or, you know, if you want to take a corporate, it's not in their business model. It's not part of the psyche. The psyche of a business is the bottom line. And there's a bit of corporate and social responsibility, and there's all that sort of stuff. And that's the nice to have within the company. And like, I know this because having been there, it's like pulling hen's teeth to try and get a bit of restoration work done. And, you know, that's just the reality. So, but what I have seen in working with the Community Wetlands Forum, the appetite and the interest that communities have to restore their peatlands. And what I would be hoping for, instead of, you know, big sums of money, which I've already witnessed going to a corporate, I'd like to see that money just making its way closer to the ground, either divested through a trust or through, you know, even a body like Irish Rural Link that will be connected with communities to facilitate the work done locally by the lads who drove the tractors and ditched the bog and did all that stuff, because hand on heart, they are the best people to reverse the drainage. They know where the water goes, they know the bog, and they watch the bog and they keep an eye on it, and it's in their interest. It's not just in their interest, they take great pride in that work and they want to see it coming on. So in relation to peatland restoration, I would be very much encouraging our ministers to reevaluate how they fund peatland restoration and to enable it to be done through communities. And a bit like funding nature and biodiversity, I have always found as well that, you know, community engagement always seemed to be a nice to have as well. And oh, we better do the community engagement and the community liaison. We better do this. Yeah. And that would be nice. But we haven't seen any plans about restoration, and there has been no engagement with the communities. And I just think, what's going on? All this money is going out for restoration. And let's be clear, it's not just the state that will be paying for the restoration. There's a huge appetite out there in companies like Amazon. The European Investment Bank is really interested in doing restoration. And they have this facility called the Natural Capital Financing Facility, you know, which is, you know, I'm in the business of trying to identify the natural capital stocks and to highlight the value of the ecosystem services. Back to what John was saying, again, everything that we're doing and talking about is connected. So the money is coming, but how it gets to the ground, that would be my main concern. And so that it gets into empower and enable communities and to build capacity there so that they can have these healthy environments and a sustainable model to get that up and running. So that's a long-term issue. A bog is for life. A bog is for generations. It's not just for 2 years of a life program or, you know, a funding or a research project.
That's really excellent, Catherine. I mean, you're really touching a very sensitive chord in my being and in Irish Rural Links, because the last number of years, as you know, we have been involved in a lot of this kind of work. And really, you know, we can't just put it into boxes and call it this, that, or the other. It needs to be part of the mainstream funding. And John Bryan, this is what I'm coming to you about. I mean, you've talked and I've talked a lot about just transition, et cetera, et cetera. And part of me thinks, okay, the transition is a principle I think we both agree with, so that's fine. The money is the other problem. And sometimes I think, if this is not really into the budget, if it's not part of the October budget in a real way, it's almost left to other sources of funding, like 100 million coming into the Midlands. I'm not quite sure, that's EU money, a lot of it and all of that. If we aren't saying that in our budget statement, what are we going to do? To take Catherine's point, how are we going to organise so that the guys with the tractors and the people who work in the fields of the bogs and around and all around agriculture generally aren't benefiting, because my fear is the just transition will go to the few but not to the many. Can we look to have it in the mainstream budget as a beginning, and then let's source the funding? How do you feel about that, John?
I always think, Seamus, that ministers and people who draw up strategy don't properly cost some of the programs, and then they talk about what I call fictional money sometimes, that will get money. And I know Catherine made a point, maybe some of the big companies might have some interest in the peatlands or that, but for general schemes, either the EU or the Irish government, if they want to fund some sort of a scheme that can be quite beneficial both to the appearance of the country and for protecting biodiversity, planting hedgerows, maintaining, protecting what we have is so important, protecting the water courses, increased buffer zones. There's a huge amount can be done there, maybe better precision use of fertilizer and things like that. All that's beneficial to everybody, but there has to be education and there has to be a level of funding. And certainly the government are talking about a new REPS type scheme. And as I said, when the first one came in 20 years ago, it almost changed the mindset of a lot of farmers, because even our advisory body at the time, it was ANCO when I started farming, now it's Tagish and that. But we were getting grants from the government to take out hedgerows and that, whereas now, no, and look, everyone, we learn, you grow older and you learn every day. But the reality is protecting all that biodiversity, nature corridors, the waterways, there's little things that can be done that can have a huge benefit for the environment, but there is a cost. If people are to leave 10% of their land idle into biodiversity protection, which is what the next CAP is proposing, and then eco schemes, which will be funded out of the money that you're already getting. So there's no new money there. Actually, the CAP budget, Pillar 1, is down 3% over the next number of years. And when you bear inflation and everything in, the EU themselves say it'll be down substantially over the next number of years. But the reality is, we all want to achieve the targets set out in the European Green Deal, farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy. It's very important. But there is no proper funding in place at the moment. So the minimum the government is going to have to do is get this new REPS type scheme up and going, put in meaningful schemes with, and that's back to what Catherine said, that you can measure the delivery, you can measure the amount of hedgerows or biodiversity that's in it, or huge other areas. Now, I wouldn't be quarters well up on the peatlands as both yourself and Catherine are, but there's areas like that that a bit of funding can have a huge benefit. So I believe it's essential that they get this REPS scheme up, but more than likely, what will the government do? Talk about it for 3 years. You know, and it's important to get these schemes. The worst example ever was they let a REP scheme run out one time, and there was a whole load of habitats and things like that. You were paid to have them this year. The year after, you were penalised on your single farm payment for. So coherence across the schemes, and that they have to follow through on things like protecting those habitats, protecting those areas. You have bird cover, you have species-rich grassland. There's a whole load of schemes. But if you let them run out at the end, and the next thing someone else in the department tells you that you could be penalised for having them, there is a lack of understanding and coordination there.
Okay.
But main thing, James, a proper, well-funded REP scheme, and they need at the minimum to get it going in 22, not 23 or 4, proper transition in 21.
Okay, I'll come back to you and that in a moment, John. We're going. I'm watching time now, and I'm going to ask that final question. But I have a comment here from a former, well, I think he's a former advisor. He's just texted me. He says, "I spent most of my life getting farmers to degrade the countryside, and the last 5 years coming to retirement, I'm trying to get them to reverse it." So, Sinead, that's the full work of his life. Thanks for that comment. Sean, you're the minister, or the two ministers in one, I don't know what way we'll have the budget presented in October the 13th, I think. What do you see, what do you want to see? One thing into the budget that will make it a proper budget given the times we're living in.
I think I take up a word that John used there, coherence. I think we need coherence across all policy areas, not just in agriculture, not just in rural development, not just on the environment, but across everything. So policy coherence, and that the basic focus of the policy in the budget should be on leaving nobody behind. And that needs to basically then develop like 5 areas simultaneously. And this has to be seen in the budget, like that you are working to develop your vibrant economy. I think we can depend on them to spend money on the economy fairly definitely. But the other pieces, you need the decent services and the infrastructure if you're going to have a vibrant economy. You need just taxation if you're going to be able to pay for the services and the infrastructure that you need for the vibrant economy. You need good governance. Now, what I would say quite specifically in this, there's going to be pay agreements and things of that nature negotiated over the next few months. It's not good enough for government to say, we negotiate a pay agreement and then whatever's left over is going to be available for the rest of society, whether that's rural Ireland, the community voluntary sector, whatever. We need a process involving all the sectors, and that means all the pillars: employers and trade unions, farming pillar, community and voluntary pillar, environmental pillar. And that should be a real process of real engagement. And finally, that sustainability, environmental, social, and economic sustainability should be at the core of everything they do in the budget. If I were to give one simple small example of a thing I missed earlier on about the carbon tax, why are airlines still not paying tax on the huge amounts of carbon that they use to fly planes and so on? They get huge breaks. They use huge amounts. Now, we might have the most efficient use of that by Irish Airlines, but the fact is they're still using huge amounts of it and not paying it. So therefore, people are not paying. And the carbon tax should be applied properly to everybody, not just to ordinary people on the ground, ordinary citizens.
Thanks, Sean. That's really, really good coherence. Certainly, we do need coherence in policy. Catherine, you're the minister. What will you be looking for this budget? One thing that you're going to say, yeah, this government is listening.
Well, my one thing, Seamus, if I was to choose one thing, I would say to invest in the land use review. It was already mentioned in the programme for government. Talking about a lip service, this has to be a cross-sectoral review. You've got to get the different departments talking to each other and saying what they're using land for, how they want to use it in the future. What are the stocks? What's the natural capital that's out there? What are the stocks of assets? And what are the flows, the important flows of services and disservices? Okay, so there's positive services and then there's, things that can harm the environment. And how are we going to use that? We're going to use that to develop a model for sustainable livelihoods and sustainable communities across Ireland. That's going to enable changes for us to restore lands, to restore a healthy environment, to reduce carbon, to improve water quality. So water it's like that indicator of everything. Without clean water, there is nothing. And that clean water, that lovely flow of water through the land, and biodiversity automatically benefits from that because there's a heightened awareness about why we're doing this. But in order for it to work, that's the top down. We need to invest in the boots on the ground. So it's a two-piece. The national parks, the rangers, they're stars, they're brilliant, they're doing a great job. They need support. The Law Pro workers and the community-led conservation and restoration. So it's not just one size fits all. We've got to work from both sides.
Catherine, very good, well said. I think you'll know him. John Thomas Cooney is coming in there. He wants he wants to see the reps, a properly funded rep scheme. John, you're the minister. What do you want to see in this budget?
Well, certainly, as I said already, Seamus, there's a transition year in the CAP, so it's very important that the government funds all the rural development programs. What I'm talking about, the GLOS, the Beef Genomics Scheme, the TAMS, Young Farmer. All those schemes are very important to maintain the fabric of rural Ireland. And then the question, Thomas, it's essential that the government get working on that this year. It's going to take them 6, 7, 8, 9 months to produce and have it ready for launching what you do. But also, and I know you said one thing, but we are facing probably in the next 30 days in a decision, yes or no, on Brexit. And if there's going to be a hard Brexit, there's going to be a massive requirement for funding to keep Ireland open, because we export 90% of our beef, 90% of our dairy now. UK has taken over 50% of the beef, 40% plus the dairy, taking a huge amount of the pork. Markets, the single market will actually stop functioning because the customs are not in place in Dover, they're not in place in Calais, they're certainly not in place in Ireland. The requirement for customs clearance, so there's going to have to be some massive funding there to keep the country open, and probably some sort of a, much as the UK have said, they won't have a transition period, there will have to be a transition period, or there will be bottlenecks everywhere. There'll be 100-mile traffic jams in both the continent and in Ireland, and there'll be a shortage of food in certain, almost unthinkable, Seamus, but there won't be food on the shelves in the UK a month after if they close it down.
Right, John. John, thank you. We'll break the broadband width if we go on any longer, so we're coming to a very quick end. So thanks, John. With that note of the empty shelves in Britain, hope my British colleagues are looking at this. Look, first of all, there's two things I'll be killed for saying. First of all, our webinars are going to continue every Thursday morning at 10 o'clock to 11. Next week, we'll be doing one on some of the European exchange projects Irish Rural Link is involved in. But on the 15th of October, I hope to have this panel, I hope, you can all come back on the 15th of October to look at, well, what was the budget like? And then we'll be in a better position to imagine it. So I hope you can come back. Sincere thanks to all of you who asked questions. We will keep those questions and try and get them answered in some way for listening. We're delighted with you turning up. To Sean, Father Sean Healy, who has certainly proven himself in terms of the budget, to Catherine Farrell and to John Bryan. A sincere thank you for really participating in a most stimulating conversation. For those of you who are not members of Irish Rural Link, as I always say, it's easy to join. See you next week. Thank you very much.